Welcome back again to Liberty Man. This is, I think, the fourth installment for Black History Month this year in 2022. We're told that our founding fathers were all slave owners and they were bigots, and what they did was useless because of that fact. There's a group of people called BLM, or Black Lives Matter. And they're pushing an agenda to discredit the Constitution of the United States. Same thing with the 1619 Project. They talk about America was founded in 1619 because slaves were brought into the colony of Virginia at that time. We're here about historical truth. We're here about historical fact. And we're going to look, we've looked at already three different eras, starting with the Constitution itself and working its way down through all of the different documents to see whether or not there's any evidence of what the original framers of our documents in our country had to say about it. So we went through the Constitution, we went through the Northwest Ordinance, the rules for statehood. And now we're going to look at the beginnings of what is the United States of America. In 1774, they first came together in what is called the Continental Congress. That Continental Congress was a seated body that functioned until 1781, when the Articles of Confederation were put into place. Those Articles of Confederation didn't work. They were terrible. So they decided to get together and have a constitutional convention and amend the Articles of Confederation, which ended up being scrapped and started over again with the what we now have as the Constitution of the United States. There was a lot went on before that time. So Americans were happy being British subjects. They didn't have any problem with it. There were just a few certain things that started to really get them when the king started making mandates and vetoing all their laws. So, and one man in particular that is completely raked over the coals on this issue as being hypocritical was the author, so-called author of the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to focus on him in a lot of this, in his writings, official writings, not just letters back and forth to his friends. And so with that in mind, once again, we are going to go to the documents. We're going to let the documents speak for themselves. A lot of this today is going to come from where I copied and pasted from this book here. It's called In God We Trusted, the U.S. Constitution and the Restoration of America. And you can look down at the description of the YouTube videos, and you'll be able to purchase a book from our website, an autographed copy, or you can get them at Barnes & Noble online and Amazon online and various different things. One cool thing is a side note about this, if you get it in Kindle, the footnotes will pop up as being blue, and you can click them and it'll take you to the source. Just like we're doing now, I'm going to take you to the source of the original documents. But for ease, I just copied and pasted out of my transcript so that I can put it in a concise thing without having to go through too many tabs to get to where we want to go. So let's share screen and get started here. This is the Declaration of Independence itself. So let's just go ahead and start here since I brought it up. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. See, this right here is where the rub is being had our nose rubbed in it today. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, how can you declare to the world that all men are created equal when, and I always pick on South Carolina because of the percentages, if all men are created equal, if half of the men or people in that state were owned by somebody else, where's the equality in that? Where's the God-given creator in unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if you're being told what to do all the time and you can't make choices on your own? Seems hypocritical, right? That to secure these rights, the governments are instituted among men, deriving their power, just powers, from the consent of the governed. They are arguing today that the slaves didn't have consent of how they were governed because they were owned by somebody else. Well, we've already gone through that, and we've shown that it was a British institution and not an American one. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. We have groups of people that want to abolish our forms of government and institute new government. Now, is there truth to the basis of their arguments? That's what I focus on as a historian. I don't get involved in the personal conflicts. I don't get involved in the policy debates. I get involved in the documents. What does the document say? What does the real history have to say? Because as I remind people all the time, any elected official puts their hand on a Holy Bible and swears, so help me God, to defend the document that these guys wrote in the 1700s. We have the ability to amend it, but we got to get 3/4 of the people or states to go along with it. Supermajority. But it says right here, if you just read this and you don't know a flipping thing about history, it says he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Okay, what were those laws that he refused his assent to? That's the key. Thomas Jefferson, in his autobiography, was absolutely livid that he allowed his full paragraph, which was bigger than this one, to be struck and replaced with this. So we're going to work our way back around to here, and we're going to go back to the 1769, I believe. We're going to start there. Now, this is Thomas Jefferson's autobiography. There was, I really knew I had stepped into something of a huge magnitude years and years ago when I was thinking about putting my thoughts on paper and writing a book on it, which, as you see, is a very large book. It's got over 1,000 footnotes in it of original stuff. And it'll hold up in the Supreme Court because most of it's cited by the Supreme Court. And yes, what this little paragraph here is cited with Jefferson and all these other things. But in 1769, a guy named Thomas Jefferson was elected to the House of Burgesses in the colony of Virginia. He was very young at that time. Here again, I'm guessing, and I apologize for not getting into that detail, but I think he was 23, 24, but he was in his early 20s. And he's saying here, I made one effort in that body for the permission of the emancipation of slaves, which was rejected. And indeed, during the regal government, nothing liberal could expect success. Our minds were circumscribed within narrow limits by a habitual belief that it was our duty to be subordinate to the mother country in all matters of government, to direct all our labors in subservience to her interest, and even to observe a bigoted intolerance for all religions but hers. The difficulties with our representatives were of habit and despair, not of reflection and conviction. Experience soon proved that they could bring their minds to rights on the first summons of their attention. But the King's Council, which acted as another house of legislature, held their places at will, meaning they were appointed by the crown, or the governor who was appointed by the crown, and were in most humble obedience to that will. The governor at that time was Norborne Berkeley, Baron de Botentot. The governor, too, who had a negative on all our laws, held by the same tenure, and with still greater devotedness to it. The last of all, the royal negative, closed the last door of every hope of amelioration. The man who could argue that human servitude was a violation of the law of nature, that under those laws all men are born free, everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person, which includes the liberty of moving and using it at his own will, and that Christianity, as it applied to the official church of the Church of England, neither is or never was part of the common law, was clearly not in sympathy with a slave-holding community living under the established church and ruled by a royal governor. So Thomas Jefferson's one of his first pieces of legislation that he presented at the age of his early 20s was the emancipation of all the slaves in Virginia, or at least giving the people the choice of emancipating their slaves if they wanted to. And it was negative by everybody but the House of Burgesses. That proposal passed by the House of Burgesses. Some of the people that signed it were George Washington, George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights, George Wythe, the mentor of and tutor for Thomas Jefferson, considered the father of American jurisprudence, Richard Bland, Peyton and Edmund Randolph, and the Pendletons. It was vetoed by King George III, who cited the following precedent of English law. Under the act of 2nd George II, this would be the second year of the reign of George II, his father, no slave was to be set free upon any pretense whatsoever, except for some meritorious services, to be adjudged and allowed by the governor and council. Acts of the Assembly, 1769. No trace of this effort is recorded in the Journal of the House of Burgesses. So there you go. Thomas Jefferson, that hated atheist slave owner, his first act as a elected official was the emancipation of the slaves. And from that point on, he was ticked. He had a vendetta that he wanted solved, and he was like a dog on a bone fighting for the freedom of the slaves. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. I'm sure you never heard that one. A summary view of the rights of British America. This was written by George Mason. If you read the whole thing, you'll see that it's very, very similar to our Bill of Rights. But anyway, this is what they brought to the table in 1770. The Virginia delegates brought to the table in 1774, the first time that all of the states came together and formed the Constitutional or the Continental Congress, which became what we have today. It evolved through the was it 4 different transitions? You had the Continental Congress that served through the Revolution. Then you had the Articles of Confederation, and they called themselves the United States and Congress assembled. And so I guess it would be 3. You had the Revolutionary Congress, or you had this Congress, and then the Revolutionary Congress start in 76, some people argue. Then you had the Articles of Confederation, which were a disaster, and they needed to be amended, and that's how we came up with the Constitution. So these men were involved in all of it from day one. So this was one of the paragraphs of a summary view of the rights of British America, written by George Mason. For the most trifling reasons, and sometimes for no conceivable reason at all, His Majesty has rejected laws of the most salutary tendency. The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies, where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibitions and by imposing duties which might amount to a prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative, thus preferring the immediate advantages of a few British corsairs to the lasting interests of the American states and to the rights of human nature deeply wounded by this infamous practice. the Virginia delegates were ticked that the king would not let them stop the slave trade. All right, folks, this is kind of changing the dynamic here of the 1619 Project and Black Lives Matter, because to these guys, Black lives mattered. They were stuck with this because of the British monarchs. They were doing everything that they could to get rid of it for the sins of their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers. This generation of men had enough of it. And so they're trying to figure out the right way to do this. They know it needs to be done. And so anyway, this is what the Virginia delegates brought to the table in 1774. And Edmund Pendleton was the first president of the United Colonies, or the United, what would become the United States. So Edmund Pendleton was the first president. George Washington was the first president under the Constitution. John Hancock was the first president under the Declaration of Independence. We don't understand those things because we're not taught it. On September the 5th of 1774, the representatives of 12 of the colonies met in Philadelphia. Georgia did not send delegates due to an Indian uprising in the colony. Lord Chatham, William Pitt, told Benjamin Franklin the following about what he thought of the men who composed this body of men. British Secretary of State talking to Benjamin Franklin while they're in Europe. Well, Franklin was in England at the time. The Congress is the most honorable assembly of statesmen since those of the ancient Greeks and Romans in the most virtuous times. They were, most of them, profound scholars and studied the history of mankind that they might know men. They were so familiar with the lives and thoughts of the wisest and best minds of the past that a classic aroma hangs about their writings and their speeches, and they were profoundly convinced of what statesmen know and mere politicians never perceive. The ideas are the life of a people, that the conscience, not the pocket, is the real citadel of a nation. Let this day be ever remembered. It saw assembled from the several colonies these great men whose names have come down to us and will descend to all posterity. Their proceedings are remarkable for simplicity, dignity, and unequaled ability. At that day, probably there could have been conceived on no part of the globe an equal number of men possessing greater talents and ability, or animated by a higher and more patriotic motive. They knew the history of the past. They were alive to all the difficulties and all the duties of the present. They acted from the first as if the future were all open before them. In such a constellation, it would be invidious to point out the bright particular stars. Let me only say that none can consider injustice to the others, that George Washington was one of the number. This first Congress, for the ability which it manifested, the principles which it proclaimed, and the characters which composed it, make an illustrious chapter in American history. Its members should be regarded not only individually, but in a group. They should be viewed as living pictures exhibiting young America as it then was, and when the seeds of its public destiny were beginning to start into life, well described by our early motto as being full of energy and prospered by heaven. Non sin dies animosus infans. The infant is not bold without divine aid. Isn't that something? Our early motto was the infant is not bold without God's assistance. Now, when these guys got together on September the 5th, one of the first things they did was they sat down and they put together the order of business of how they were going to organize, how they were going to have their rules, which they still have today. Each house of the legislature has their own, they get to set their own rules of procedure. There's a lot of controversy going on in the Senate up there about how they should do things because there's a 50-50. Anyway, they decided that they were going to open with prayer. Now, this was not just any little prayer. This thing lasted for, I think, 4 hours. The delegates to this Congress wrote letters home to their friends, their legislatures, their wives, their children, their families, and we've got most of their writings still intact today because the family, I mean, a written letter was a big deal, and so they would save them all, and very few of them are lost to history. Most of them are still intact, but they wrote more about that prayer service by Reverend Doucet than anything else about the whole entire Congress. But the one thing that they did, they sent a letter to the king, they sent a letter to Canada, and they sent a letter to the people in the 13 colonies, expressing what they were trying to do, what they were trying to organize, that they're trying to reconcile all these differences with Great Britain. And they just wanted to be heard. And so they tell them what they're going to do, but they wrote out articles of association. This is going to be our bylaws as a government. And article number 2 says, and this was unanimous. This wasn't just a willy-nilly thing here. This was unanimous by all the delegates. We will neither import nor purchase any slave imported after the first day of December next, after which time we will wholly discontinue the slave trade and will neither be concerned in it ourselves, nor we hire our vessels or sell our commodities or manufactures to those who are concerned in it. Boycott. We're just going to boycott the slave trade. See how you like that. See how we bankrupt your country. Now, we hear a lot about crony capitalism. So we need to pause right here with this narrative of the laws and the legal stuff with the government and understand why the king was so adamant about vetoing all the issues with the slaves. Remember, I mentioned before that slavery was a British institution, not an American one, because this document right here began America as states. This was the seed that was planted governmentally that became the United States of America. The slave trade was sanctioned beginning with Queen Elizabeth in the 1500s. It morphed into what they called the South Seas Trading Company, which was given a monopoly on the slave trade for Great Britain. In exchange for that monopoly, the South Seas Trading Company they had to pay the Parliament £250,000 a year, British pounds, their monetary unit, to go toward the payments of the debt of all the wars that they had had. They had the Cromwell Wars, they had wars with France, they had the French and Indian War they had just come out of in the 1760s, and all these things. So the king's not going to let go of that cash cow. You follow me? He can't get rid of this £250,000 a year that goes to the debt of the nation. I saw a thing the other day that maybe 1/20th of the budget of all of England was to the needs of the government. The other 19/20ths went to pay off the debt. I mean, these guys were in deep trouble. But the arrogance of the kings, nope, can't do it. Can't do it. Now, with that in mind, the Americans, in their first act as a united colonies, was stop the slave trade, 1774. Thomas Jefferson, 1769. 1774, the Summary View of the Rights of British America. At the Congress in 1774, get rid of the slave trade. We're going to bankrupt your butts. We're not going to allow your vessels to dock in our ports. We're going to confiscate your cargoes, yada, yada, yada. This was the unanimous declaration of all the delegates present. It was signed by Peyton Randolph, the largest slaveholder in Virginia, as president. It was followed by the signature of each of the delegates separated by colony. The foregoing association, being determined upon by Congress, was ordered to be subscribed by the several members thereof, and thereupon we have hereunto set our respective names accordingly. When you put your name on a document, it's like signing a check. You're responsible for everything in that document. So if the government of Great Britain is going to come chop some heads off, yours is going to be one of them. It's right there on the paper. Now, this is something that I, right here, I think is one of my favorite little pet peeves of I gotcha. My son gave me a copy of a book called Founding America, Documents from the Revolution to the Bill of Rights. It's a great book. It's about this thick. I mean, it's up there. But it's got documents going, every legal government document from the states and the colonies, all the way up through the Bill of Rights, is documents of the Revolution to the Bill of Rights. Now, my son was all proud to give it to me because he had found something that I could use for my research, and he helped me with some of my research. So I looked up to see if this declaration of the First Continental Congress in 1774 was there, and it was. It was on page 74. So the delegates that signed it are all there. Now, Georgia didn't attend, so there were only 12. So Georgia's excused because they didn't come at all. Like Rhode Island didn't participate in the Constitutional Convention. They were opposed to it altogether. They figured they were so little, didn't matter what they said, they were going to get walked all over. But anyway, they decided to come on board once it was done. Thankfully, they did. But get this. 3 of the colonies are not represented in this modern book. Now, I've got it stashed away in my archives, and I didn't bother to get it out. But it's footnoted down here, so if you want to look it up and go to Barnes & Noble and get it yourself, you're more than welcome. The entire delegations of Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, Georgia didn't attend, are nowhere listed. An omission of this magnitude can only be deliberate, because this is a modern book. The argument cannot be made that it was for space limitations, because over 1/3 of the page is blank. The official document, published by order of the Congress, contains the names of those delegates. See, this modern book took out the names of the Southern colonies. I mean, Edmund Pendleton was the president of that Congress. George Washington was in attendance. George Washington is considered the greatest man that ever lived. We're not taught that one for sure in our schools. But all of Europe, all of the civilized world in the 1700s recognized George Washington as the greatest man in the history of the world up to that time. And I beg to differ or question anybody who thinks that there's somebody since then that has surpassed what that man accomplished in his life. That's my personal perspective, but it's an educated opinion. Virginia, Richard Henry Lee, George Washington, Patrick Henry Jr., Richard Bland, Benjamin Harrison, and Edmund Pendleton, all plantation owners. North Carolina, William Hooper, John Hughes, Richard Caswell, all plantation owners. South Carolina, Henry Middleton, Thomas Lynch, Christopher Gadsden, John Rutledge, Edward Rutledge, all plantation and slave owners. Those names are on that original document. Only somebody that wants to deliberately forge a document deleted those names. I would like to find the editor of that book and file a lawsuit against them for forgery, because that's what they did. You take a clause out of a contract, it's a forgery. You add a clause to the contract after it's signed, it's a forgery. Take it as you will. So that's pretty mind-boggling here, guys, that every one of the colonies unanimously signed the document for the United Colonies at the time that we will neither import nor purchase any slave imported after the first day of December next, which would be in 1774. After which time we will wholly discontinue the slave trade. We will neither be concerned in it ourselves, nor will we hire our vessels or sell commodities or manufacturers to those who are concerned in it. That's the official government documents of the United States of America. Now we're going to get to the Declaration of Independence. We're going to just go right back up here again so we're not making nothing up. This paragraph right here is, he has refused his assent to laws most wholesome and necessary for the public good. We just saw that one of the main things that year after year after year they were complaining about was the negation of the slave laws that the colonies were passing to end the slave trade in America, so that they could figure out how to emancipate or enfranchise or let people become citizens. They had to do it right. You can't just turn a slave free and say, okay, here you go figure life out on your own, when they're not educated to do so. That would be terrible. So with the Declaration of Independence, it says, before looking at the final document, there is a significant section in the reasons for separation that was omitted, and one significant addition that will be highlighted here. This is my words in my book. The one omitted dealt with the issue of slavery. To think that this issue could have been solved at this time is huge. 2 votes would have settled an issue that took a civil war and the lives of over 600 Americans to settle over 90 years later. Like I said, I was really hard on Darius Spearman and his proposition that how the United States Constitution made the Civil War inevitable. It was the votes of these 2 states right here that could be said that if you would have just voted for it, then we could have ended it in the Declaration of Independence, which is true. Only Georgia and South Carolina refused to agree to this term in the original. This was the original draft by Thomas Jefferson that made it out of committee and to the floor of the entire delegation. Georgia and South Carolina refused to the point of, we won't vote for independence whatsoever for any reason if this is allowed to stand. Now, their reasoning was that if all their slaves were given freedom before the war was won, hundreds of thousands of them would immediately fight for the British Army. The founders knew that slavery had to end in America. This was just not the time to do it. They knew they had to win the war first to make it stand and still have a country. The British Army and the British governors, almost immediately after the shooting started in 1775 and early 76, the royal governors told the slaves, if you'll escape from your plantations and your masters and come over and serve in the British Army, we'll give you your freedom. And a lot of them did that. Thousands and thousands and thousands that did that. But you know what? The British Army left them stranded. They just dumped them. I mean, they were in big trouble. Some of them were allowed to go to Canada, but the vast majority were just left sitting there when the British left. Now, this is the original clause of what became, he has whatever negated our good and wholesome laws. He, King George III, has incited treasonable insurrection of our fellow citizens with the allurement of forfeiture and confiscation of our property, bribery. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, the Muslim pirates, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. That this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying for former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with the crimes he urges them to commit against the lives of another. Think about that, guys. Americans were ticked, especially Thomas Jefferson. This is a blistering, you stink in your face against the king. And he's talking about here about what the royal governors were doing to get the slaves to come fight for the British. Why do you want to go fight for the British when it was the British that wouldn't let us free you in the first place? Most of the slaves knew that if they wanted freedom, the Americans would have to win the war. Because only a few of them were able to get off the plantations and go join the army. The rest of them, they knew were going to still be slaves after the war was over, because Great Britain was very adamant about stopping the slave trade. By the end of the war, some sources say that as many as 25% of all the Continental Army soldiers, were black soldiers. Now, we're going to get into some of those guys and their exploits in further videos that we're going to produce during Black History Month. Another thing that they added to the bottom of the Declaration of Independence was the phrase, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Let's go back over here to the Declaration of Independence and read it verbatim. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Then they signed it. By signing this document, see, George Wythe, Richard Henry Lee, these guys were all there in 1774. I think William Hooper was there in 74. Rutledge was there in 74. Middleton was there in 74. But by signing this document, they were signing a bill of attainder, which they would be hung, drawn, and quartered, meaning they would be brutally slaughtered. Their head would be cut off and put on a pike on the Tower of London. 4 parts of their body, quartered, would be ripped apart by horses, and each quarter of the body would be taken to the 4 corners of the kingdom to display what happened to people that committed treason. And then all of their property, all of their wealth and would be confiscated, and their children would never be able to hold title to anything in perpetuity if they didn't win the war. And they knew this, but they said, we're not going to sign it without a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. God is going to protect us. We're not going to sign this without declaring in God we trust. But they pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We're facing the biggest challenge that America has faced domestically since this time. We have a very, very polarized country. We have a very polarized government. The seesaw effect between one administration and the next is radical and drastic. We went from the greatest prosperity that we've had in decades to now the deepest poop that we've been in since almost the Great Depression, in a year, because of the choice of our rulers. But if we want to fix this country, we've got to, as a people, red, yellow, black, and white. American is the only thing that matters. That flag over there and what those 13 stripes stand for is who we are as a country, because we haven't been taught. Anything that I've shared with you in the last 4 videos is one of the reasons we need to take our country back and put the truth back in the classroom. But we need to mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, or our posterity, which means our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. They're going to have less freedom and liberties than we do now. I've taken this pledge, I've sworn this oath, and I've pledged my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor to my friends and fellow people that I work with. Some of the greatest people in America, I'll just tell you that. And it's a privilege to know these men and women and what we've been able to put together over the last few years. It's been a lot of fun. I'm a small fish in a big pond, guys. I just live here in Mississippi, and I love my country, and I'm doing what I know to do to present publicly the truth of our country and try to make it applicable to the times. So that's the truth of our country. Frederick Douglass declared in his latter years, the Constitution is one of the greatest anti-slavery documents ever written. He was the guy for anti-slavery before the Civil War. But because people compromised, They compromised and compromised and compromised. Nobody had the guts to stand and honor their oath of office like these guys did when they signed the Declaration of Independence. They had to, for the exigencies of the time, let it lie. They had to table the slavery issue to win the war first. But we've seen in the progress of this, going from the end back down to the beginning, that they had done everything within their legislative powers in the colonial era to start getting rid of a disease that was contrary to the laws of nature and nature's God, that all men are created equal. They understood that principle. That's why they were so adamant about ending slavery in their lifetimes. Well, they compromised, gave them 20 years. The next generation that came along, they didn't do it. They didn't do it. We can no longer afford to kick the can down the road. We have got to end it now. We've got to end this progressivism in our country now. We've got to fight it with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, like we did the British in the 1760s, in the 1770s and 1780s. We have got to get back to our true foundation. And our foundation is strong. Our foundation is sure, because our foundation are the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments of the Holy Bible. But we need to get back to America's origins. And so anyway, continue to follow us at Liberty Man, DOTONLINE. That's LIBERTYDOTONLINE. If you understand the code, it will be very simple for you to find us, so that we won't be censored like so many other people. And yet this is the truth. All we do is present truth and facts that are not debatable and not even up to discussion. So I would love to come and talk with your group, your organization, your friends, your family. We can Zoom it. We can do it in person. We can do it in a Coliseum. Whatever you want to do to win this war, I'm willing to help you. So contact us and let us know what we can do to help. But also friend us, like us, and share this with all your friends and make this kind of stuff go viral. Or sit around and post on Facebook and say everything sucks. It's up to you. But if you want to do something that matters, come on board and let's rebuild the country. Amen. God bless. You're the best.